It is my great pleasure to welcome here as the first speaker the clinical lead of the psilocybin trial for depression at the Imperial College in London. She focused on the qualitative research of the mechanism of action of psilocybin and LSD from the perspective of the patients which underwent this experience. She's going to talk about the Hexaflex model of the psychological flexibility as an adjunct to the psychedelic therapy. So please help me to welcome here Rosalind Watts.
Oh yeah, I had to turn it on, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about the Hexaflex, which many of you may not have heard of before. It's a tool from a kind of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. And there are going to be a few of us talking about that type of therapy this weekend. James Close, Jeff Gus, later today as well. So acceptance and commitment therapy is it's a third wave approach. It's related to cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's really about noticing what the mind is doing, which is usually a control agenda. It's usually about trying to help. It's the ego talking and choosing something else instead. It's about helping people really surrender to the fullness of life. It's about helping them embrace suffering in the pursuit of meaning. So I came across, I'm by no means an ACT expert at all. I'm a clinical psychologist. Before I started working at the Imperial Psychedelic Research Group, I was working in the National Health Service in London, a talking therapist, and ACT was one of the models I was trained in and used, but that was many, many years ago, and it was only after doing qualitative research with people after taking psychedelics that I kind of went back to ACT because I could see that it was doing something very similar. I think that the ACT and psychedelics, they kind of mirror the same psychological mechanisms, perhaps. So, yeah, we did the psilocybin for depression study at Imperial, and I interviewed the 20 participants of that. And I asked them what had changed for them, what the psilocybin experience did. And there were these two very strong themes, that psilocybin helped them to be more connected and more accepting. Connection and acceptance were the two strong themes. And so it was when I did that qualitative research that I kind of went back to ACT and thought, how can we bring these two things together? And what we're seeing now is that the ACT community and the psychedelic research community are realizing, they're recognizing that they have all these similarities and they're starting to collaborate. So it's going to be very interesting to see what emerges from that collaboration. So going back to what ACT does, it's quite difficult to describe what it does because it's obviously, it would take me longer than a few minutes to describe. So I'm just going to try and kind of encapsulate the essence of it in a nutshell. It's about helping people break free from their old patterns and habits, these habits that are usually ruled by the ego, the part of ourselves that wants to keep us safe. And when we think about what the psychedelic experience does, so I'm going to borrow an analogy from my colleague Mendel Kaelen. So when describing what psychedelics do for people with depression, he asked people to imagine a snowy mountain. And imagine you're sledging down that mountain. And you sledge down and you make a track in the snow. And if you sledge down over and over again, always down the same path, the path gets deeper and deeper until it gets so rigid that there's no wiggle room. There's nowhere else you can go. You're stuck in a rut. And after a while, the sides of the rut get so high that you can't even see out of it. You can't see anything else. And soon you will be hitting rock bottom. You'll be getting trapped in the bedrock and snowed in. And then a psychedelic experience can come along, a bit like a snowplow, and kind of mush up those deep ridges in the snow. It comes along, and from the chaos of that day, it's not always chaotic, but it often is, a smoother landscape can emerge. So the sledger at the top of the mountain, it has a smooth, snowy landscape to look at and can decide where to go. Can go here or go there. And it's that kind of freedom, that flexibility that allows people to change their lives afterwards. And Matt Johnson was talking about psychological flexibility earlier, and he gave a nice quote actually from Emerson, which was, "Do not go where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." And it's that flexibility that lets people go off the beaten track and do something new. So how does ACT help people achieve psychological flexibility? Well, mainly by bringing awareness to the way language limits life. So language is what allows us to pursue a meaningful life and have values and think about when and how we want to do things. So it's what allows the sledger to decide that it doesn't want to sledge down to the bottom, but the sledger wants to go over and look at a forest or go and visit a village on the other side. But language is also what introduces doubt, fear. It enables us to visualize all the bad things that can happen to us in the forest, and so we decide not to go there. And ACT is about, ACT terms this the dark side and the light side of language. And what ACT is trying to do is to expand and promote the light side of language, planning, meaning, value, doing things that matter, making your life about something, whilst also minimizing and managing the dark side of language. So helping people notice what their mind is doing, how their mind is sabotaging them, and choosing something different. It's about loosening mental control so they can be in the moment, be in their bodies. And it's essentially about the hero's journey, going into the dark forest and pursuing meaning, even if you have to face your demons in the eye. And that is what ACT and psychedelics are both doing. So I'm finally going to get onto my first slide. Okay. So the psilocybin for depression study that we did, I'm going to go through this very, very briefly. It finished 2 years ago. We're about to start our next psilocybin for depression study, which is going to be bigger, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But in the last study, it was a pilot study, 20 participants with treatment-resistant depression, 2 psilocybin sessions a week apart, 10 milligrams and then 25 milligrams. And we had very, very good results, very large, huge, in fact, effect sizes. So yeah, we found that for most people, they had this 2 to 3 month relief from depression symptoms. So this is a graph that shows effect sizes for different treatments for depression. So, placebo, talking therapy, and then medication. And you can see that talking therapy and medication are both about the same, and they're both a bit better than placebo, but not that much better, but they have large effect sizes. And then you see those same treatments. So on the right-hand side, it's that same, those ones there. But then you see on the left-hand side, psilocybin. So the first column is psilocybin after 1 week. The next is after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 3 months. So the really interesting bit about the graph is here. You can see that 3 months after a high dose of psilocybin, the reduction in depression 3 months afterwards was greater than if someone taking medication every day. Now, this was done with 12 participants in the psilocybin part of this, so we can't get too excited at all. Very much this is the exuberance of the forming stage, very, very early first studies, but there is something really key here. People, having worked in the study as a guide, as a therapist, I saw myself, people that had had depression for decades, have no depression for a few months. It was extraordinary. So that was the quantitative results section. Now I'm going to look at the qualitative results. So there were 2 main change processes, as I said before. The 2 main things that were happening is that people were going from disconnection to connection and from avoidance of negative emotion to acceptance. So connection and acceptance. And you can see, if you look at the sub-themes, in depression, they felt disconnected from themselves, disconnected from others, from the world around them. And then afterwards, they described feeling connected to other people, to the world, to nature, sometimes to a spiritual principle. And the other process there, people described how in depression so in ACT, it's called experiential avoidance, and it's basically a kind of bargain that people make. They say, I do not want to have pain, emotional pain and suffering. I'm not willing to have it. So as a bargain, I'm going to have a small life. I'm not going to do the things that will bring me suffering. I'm going to try and keep myself safe. So life gets smaller and smaller, and that's what people described, that they were ruminating a lot. Ruminating is a kind of problem-solving strategy. It's a way that the ego tries to kind of keep us safe, going over and over and over problems. And it can really block emotional processing. When you're in your head the whole time, you can't be in your heart, you can't be in your belly, you're not in your body, you're just stuck there. So people described they were ruminating a lot, which shut down their emotions. They were quite numb. They would avoid painful emotions any way they could. They would avoid thinking about traumatic childhood memories, which most of them had. And then the psilocybin experienced this wave of emotion. They surrendered to it, and they learned many lessons about sitting with negative emotion that stayed with them for many months afterwards. So what I'm going to try and suggest in this talk is that, well, this is the Hexaflex, first of all. This is the thing, like the main point. The Hexaflex is this tool in ACT which describes psychological flexibility, and it actually has two hexaflexes. The one on the left is psychological inflexibility. The one on the right is psychological flexibility, and they're kind of mirror images of each other. And essentially what I'm wondering is whether, rather than saying that people went from avoidance of emotion and disconnection to connection and acceptance of emotion, that I can just talk instead about going from psychological inflexibility to psychological flexibility. And I hope that you'll see why I raise that question now, because if you look at the Hexaflex and you look at the different processes, they very much tie in with the same themes. So on the left-hand side, you have experiential avoidance, not wanting to sit with difficult feelings. Cognitive fusion, so experiential avoidance, cognitive fusion, which is essentially fusing with a negative thought, kind of going down the rabbit hole with it. So you're doing something, a negative thought comes along, and instead of letting it pass and thinking that it's not you, it's just a thought, it doesn't have to be true, it's fusing with it, thinking it defines you, and letting it kind of paralyze you. Attachment to a conceptualized self, which is, I am depressed, I'm a failure, and seeing yourself in a rigid way. Dominance of the past or the future is essentially rumination and worry. And then on the right-hand side, you see lack of values and also inaction, so not being able to act on values anyway. And then you see the opposite of all of those processes on the right-hand side: acceptance, contact with the present moment, values, committed action in service of those values, self as context, which is a kind of difficult one to explain, but I will a bit later, and cognitive diffusion, so it's detaching from those negative thoughts. So if we can say that rather than going from disconnection and avoidance to acceptance and connection, we can just say that people become more psychologically flexible, it's obviously a lot easier to say, but there are other important things too. There's a big body of research showing that psychological flexibility correlates with well-being, and that psychological inflexibility correlates with mental disorders. And also we know from research that if you train someone in psychological flexibility, that their therapy outcomes will improve. So it's an important thing, but it's also very difficult to achieve. And in ACT, people have weekly sessions, and it's hit or miss. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. And it can take a very, very long time to achieve these changes in psychological flexibility. So if a psychedelic session can do in one day what people might be trying to do in months and months, or even years in ACT, then that's massive. And I think it can. So psychological flexibility. So what I did, and what I'm going to go through now, is I looked over, so there's lots of different ways to test out this hypothesis that maybe what we're talking about is psychological flexibility. One way of doing it is to include a measure of psychological flexibility in our research, and we're going to do that in the next study. And the measure we'll include is called the AAQ. And James is going to be talking about the AAQ, which was used in a survey study of psychedelic users as well, and did see an improvement in psychological flexibility. So that's a way of looking at it quantitatively, looking at this measure. But if you want to look at it qualitatively, then that's also important. So I looked at the transcripts of the 20 participants in the last study, the psilocybin for depression study that we finished 2 years ago. And I wanted to see if I could analyze the data in line with these 6 principles. So I went through all the data, I analyzed it, and I found that it did work. It was very, very relevant. This structure, this framework, absolutely corresponded to what they were saying and what they told me. And I saw that actually you can fit it into 2 triads. So the research found this very strong theme of acceptance and of connection. And I found that the Hexaflex can be organized into an acceptance triad and a connection triad. And I think actually this distinction is clinically really helpful for people. So on the left-hand side, you have the acceptance triad. And that is about inner work. It's about diffusing from negative thoughts, being in my body, being in my senses, being in myself, and then accepting the emotion, being willing to feel it. It's the inner journey. It's the journey into the shadow, the journey into the self. And then on the right-hand side, the connection triad, which is about expansion, opening up my sense of self, connecting to other people, connecting to the world. So it's an inner process of acceptance and an outer process of expansion and connection. So I'm going to go through giving a few examples of patient quotes for these triads. So firstly, the acceptance triad. So diffusing from thoughts, sensing yourself in the moment and feeling your emotions. So the first one we'll look at is cognitive diffusion. So our participants described rumination like a washing machine going round in their heads all the time. And cognitive diffusion was pretty difficult for them. You know, people talk about this idea of a train going through the station and don't get on the train, let it pass through. But it's really, really hard for people. They've got these very well-trodden paths of getting on that train and being paralyzed by that. So they described how in psilocybin, so one person described it as like a holiday away from the prison of her brain. It felt open, it felt free, it felt different. It wasn't the same old thought processes. She wasn't worrying about what she did yesterday wrong. She wasn't worrying about what she was going to do that evening. She wasn't thinking about what her friends thought of this or that. She wasn't in those same old habits. She was having a completely different experience, bouncing around the universe as a ball of energy and feeling free and expanded. So that feeling of mental clarity and expansion was really welcome for people. And it was often described as a kind of reset. The reset switch had been, so for each of the quotes, I'm going to give you one from the acute phase and one from the long-term phase. So each of those processes, I'll try and explain them, what happened in the psilocybin session. So how did diffusion happen in the psilocybin session? And then what did diffusion look like for people in the 6 months afterwards? So diffusion in the psilocybin session. The reset switch had been pressed so everything could run properly. Thoughts could run more freely. All these networks could work again. It unlocked certain parts which were restricted before. And that sense of openness and mental clarity and freedom stayed with people for many months. Not all of them, but many of them. So this is 6 months later. My mind works differently now. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context and out of time, and now my thoughts feel like they make sense with context and logical flow. And it's that idea of flow and flexibility I think is so important. So now contact with the present moment. Again, people in depression describe not being able to contact the present moment because they were so trapped in their heads. But the psychedelic experience was one of rich moment-by-moment sensory experience, feeling how their bodies were changing, feeling how the sights of things were changing, visual perception changing, very much feeling in the moment. Being in the moment with the music, every note of the music feeling like they were absolutely in every note and on a journey with it. One person who hadn't ever experienced any real sexual pleasure in his whole life had a 6-hour experience of sensual bliss and pleasure. For many other people, there are lots of other ways that the sensory experience was really significant and therapeutic. So here's a quote from someone who, straight after the experience of seeing everything in this very vivid, clear way, when I went outside, everything was very bright and colourful and it felt different. I noticed things I didn't usually notice. The leaves on the trees and the birds, small details. So just being able to be much more mindful straight away. And again, that lasted for months. Not as strongly. People describe these kind of technicolor experiences and feeling very, very much like everything had been turned up a notch, like their vision had been turned up a notch and their taste and everything had been turned up a notch for like maybe a few days afterwards. But then months afterwards, for some of them, there was still a glimmer of something that was still, their senses were still more engaged. So this is a lady that lived near a park and never really noticed it. And then after psilocybin, this was 6 months later, she said, I would look over at the park and it would be so green, a type of green I'd never experienced before. Being among the trees was incredible, like experiencing them for the first time, so vibrant, so alive, and things look different even now, 6 months later. And now acceptance. So this is willingness. Willingness is sometimes used instead of acceptance. I think it's a better word, really. Willingness to feel pain. I think we live in a time and place where we really don't have the support or the structures or the tools to sit with our pain, to learn from it, to really let it take us over. We're taught to numb it or to fix it. And we have lots of different ways in our consumer society of doing that. So if we feel pain, we might take a pill, drink something, smoke something, buy something. We have many ways of numbing our pain. And experiential avoidance is something that is common in depression, this feeling of, because pain can feel so overwhelming and people don't feel that they're well enough equipped or supported to go through it, of just, I don't want to feel that pain. And so people make this bargain and they make their lives smaller and smaller. But the psilocybin experience is a lesson in acceptance for most people. It's a lesson in willingness to feel. It's a very brave thing to do. So apart from anything else, in terms of this expanding this willingness and this courage, it's doing something very, very brave and different to their normal experience. But on the day itself, people would take the capsules, and obviously they're in a supportive environment. They've had the preparation. They're with a therapist they trust. But these feelings that have been pushed down, deep grief, deep rage, sadness, these feelings could not be resisted. They took them over like a wave, and they cried. People cried that hadn't cried for many years. Cried and wailed and howled. There was so much emotion, and it was cathartic for people, but they also felt a sense of love there, because in the psilocybin experience there is often this sense of love and containment and being held. So they were able to dip down into the recesses of their deepest fears and shame, whilst at the same time feeling held. And it was profoundly therapeutic for people. I think the other thing is that psilocybin helped them access these things, because often they'd say in their screening, I want to know why I'm depressed. I just don't know why. I wish I could know. I wish I could understand. But they couldn't access often things from their past. And then in the experience itself, they could access things that they'd long forgotten. So a quote from a participant: "It opened a box in my chest that I didn't know was there. I don't think anything else would have led me back there. I didn't understand the emotions on a rational level, what they were about. It was just feelings, fear, sadness, and they just took over. And I did cry. It felt like a relief. I was getting so emotional, I could feel it all coming out." And then this seemed to translate into an expanded emotional repertoire for many months. I took away from the experience that I used to get angry about having anxiety. Now I think I can have it. I can just feel it and it will go. I don't have to run away. So a very good example of psychological flexibility there, being able to tolerate it and knowing it will pass. So that's the acceptance triad, the inner work of accepting the pain. And then the connection triad. So, okay, connection to self. Self as context is really tricky to explain to people in ACT. And one of the things that psychedelics can really do for ACT, if these two models do get combined, which I hope they will, and Jeff Gus is starting to pioneer this at NYU already, or at Yale already. And self as context, it's the psychedelic experience gives people an experiential taste of what the self as context is about if they've never done any meditation or anything else that's given them a sense of it. So it's really difficult to describe. One way of describing it is like saying that it's kind of the self with a big S. So if the ego self, the normal self, is self with a little s, the self as context is the big self with a big S. It's an expanded sense of self. It's the sky, not the weather. So the sky, it can be a storm, it can be rainy, the sun will come out, and whatever goes on with these weather changes, the sky is not hurt in any way. It remains the same. And people can get this sense of being like the sky, not the weather. One of the ways this happened in the study was a bit like in meditation. When you observe your thoughts and feelings, you are not your thoughts and feelings. If you can see them coming through and passing, then you're not them. You're bigger than them. You contain them, but you aren't them. And one person described how in the psychedelic experience, she, whatever harrowing things she went through, there was a part of herself watching. So even in an ego death, you're watching yourself die, but you're not actually dying, you're watching yourself. So it gives people this experiential taste of being the sky, not the weather, the observer self. The other way people experienced it was encountering parts of themselves that they hadn't met before, a wise self, a teacher self, a compassionate self. they met these kind of beings that were part of themselves, that gave them these loving messages, and they were able to embody these new parts and hold them in mind, and it changed the way they spoke to themselves. So not so much the castigating self-talk of the ego of you are a failure, you are rubbish, but a new voice was encountered, a more loving presence that they incorporated into themselves. And of course, the other way as well is if people have a mystical experience, they described how it really changed the way they saw themselves forever. They encountered themselves as beings that wouldn't, lots of different complicated things to say there, but experiencing yourself as kind of everlasting, that you have a soul, or experiencing yourself as having God within you. These are things that even after people's depression symptoms came back, they saw themselves in a different way. And that would probably never change. So in the acute phase, I had an encounter with a being with a strong feeling that that was myself, telling me it's all right. I don't need to be sorry for all the things I've done. I had an experience of tenderness towards myself. And during that experience, there was a feeling of true compassion I'd never felt before. And then the feeling of being in the presence of something divine, something holy that is real and within you. And this went on in the long term, this feeling of, it's almost as if when you take the capsules, it's like taking on board your own psychotherapist. So your sense of self has expanded. You've got something new inside you. You've met a new part of yourself. And then values. So in depression, people can struggle to get in touch with values. Things feel very meaningless sometimes. They don't really know what they want their life to be about because things feel futile and pointless. But in the psilocybin sessions, people have very strong kind of collisions with meaning and with values. So this is a lovely quote to give you a kind of taste of what it's like for someone when they have this collision with a value, new value. This is about connection to nature. When I first took the rose, I thought, it doesn't smell particularly nice, it's a rose kind of thing. And then I took it and the petals started to move. It got my attention. It wasn't just visual, there was a communication going on. The rose was sort of flooding me. It was almost love, I suppose, this very strong communication. It was like there was nobody else, just me and the rose. And the most remarkable thing was I passed the rose to the guide and the rose just wilted. It died in seconds. He handed it back and it came back to life again. I could have watched it for days. It was so beautiful. And this sense of this new connection to nature, this value lasted. So he bought a rose and had a rose with him and started doing more gardening, and it was meaningful for him. Before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing like a TV or a painting. You're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. And another value that was very common as well as connection to nature was this recognition of interconnectedness and seeing other people in a very different way, and that would change their value system. And finally, the last part of this connection triad is committed action, actually doing things in service of your values. In the psychedelic experience, people had all these lessons about how to achieve their goals. Sometimes it was almost like they downloaded a kind of plan with step-by-step guides of how to achieve some goal. And sometimes it was a more kind of almost like a natural unconscious shift that just took place. So this next one is one of my favorite quotes. It's about how one of the participants had this kind of insight about how she must become vegetarian, and that they brought her an omelette. Well, actually vegan. She must become vegan, and they brought her an omelette in the study day, and she couldn't eat it. So it happened. This change, this committed action, happened straight away. This female voice, she was so eloquent. Just don't worry. I know things are bad now, but as you live, it will change. Do not eat land animals. I said, I like chicken and meat. And she said, no, it is not good for you. This is a being that she encountered in the session. They brought in an egg sandwich, and I remember looking at it and saying, you're taking eggs from a chicken? I can't eat this. So sometimes these changes just happened straight away. And another quote about someone going vegetarian. I know I'm giving two about this. I just think it does require a lot of commitment because we eat 3 meals a day. So going vegetarian is really a good demonstration of a lot of commitment. As soon as I came back, my eating habits all changed. I just wanted to eat vegetarian. Something had changed in me. It was an appreciation for life, appreciating living things. And if you appreciate things that live, you don't want to kill them. And this was a farmer speaking, so that had been part of his livelihood. So overall, I think the model is supported. I think the participant accounts, I've just used one quote for each each process here to try and give you an idea, but I do think that what we were seeing is a change in psychological flexibility. And I think there are benefits from working with the ACT model. It's clinically useful. We're going to use it in our next study. So the next study that we're going to do is we're comparing escitalopram with psilocybin. So it's a brain mechanism study. Our primary outcome is brain images of amygdala response to fearful faces. So it's not a therapy study. We're giving people really the minimal amount of prep, session support and integration that we can give. We're doing supported psychedelic treatment as opposed to a therapy study. The next study we'd like to compare, I'd like to compare psilocybin with ACT versus psilocybin with support, but at the moment we're looking at mechanisms. But I really want to include the Hexaflex as a framework for the therapists when thinking about participants and the areas they struggle with and things that they find more easy. And I also really want to use it as an integration tool. So we've got an integration group that meets once a month in London, and the purpose of that, it was really set up ahead of the next study so that when people have gone through the study, they can join in that integration group. And this integration group is using the Hexaflex as a model for supporting and integrating psychedelic experience. I also think it's really important for psychedelic therapy to align with contemporary therapies, to have a shared language, and also to start thinking about standardizing the approach as we look at these RCTs and big studies that are happening. But I don't think it should be too standardized. And the thing I really love about ACT, and particularly the Hexaflex, is that it's a map, not a manual. It's something for participants themselves to have a look at. It's a reminder. It's a reminder of how to get back to psychological flexibility rather than a very directive set of guidelines for exactly what they should be doing or not doing. It can be very individualized, and it's empowering for people. But it also needs to be simple, and I think that the Hexaflex, as amazing as it is quite a complicated diagram. So what I've tried to do is simplify it. So this is essentially an adapted version of the Hexaflex for use. We're going to use it with our participants. We're using it in the Psychedelic Integration Group in London. And it's emphasizing this idea of two directions, going inwards to accept, and then expanding to connect to the outer world. And I think these two processes are really important, because if you just connect to the wider world and to spirituality and to nature and to other people, but you don't do the inner work, you don't do the shadow work, you don't accept what's there, it can be a bit flimsy, it can be a bit disingenuous, that can be a bit like spiritual bypassing too sometimes. It's all love and light, but none of the darkness. But if you do all of the kind of, if you do all of the accepting and all of the swimming around in the soup of your emotions and dealing with your pain, but then you don't use it for anything, you don't connect, then, what's that in service of? You've got to connect too. So I think these two processes are really important, and they happen in tandem. And it's also a simple thing for people. So it's like, say someone's had the psychedelic experience and then they're starting to struggle a bit. So we think from the last study that people may well feel this couple of months feeling of flexibility, depression symptoms are very, very mild, everything feels very open and spacious, and then after about 2 months, the depression symptoms start to creep back in, and that's the time when building the psychological flexibility is going to be, having that muscle is going to be really important, because in the same way as if you went on a yoga retreat and you became really physically flexible for a week, and then you came back and you didn't do any yoga, you're going to get really rigid again. It's the same with psychedelics. A psychedelic experience is a bit like a kind of yoga retreat for your mind. You get really flexible, you need to come back and practice, you need to maintain that flexibility. And so this model is designed as a reminder and a support for people as they try and maintain their flexibility. So as you can see, for each of the processes, there's a little statement to kind of help people remember what that process is about. So say someone is having a bad day, things are feeling tough, you go to diffuse. So that's about, where is this thought taking me? Is that where I want to go? So just a reminder, how old is that thought? How old is that story? Does that thought take me down the same track to the bottom of the mountain? Maybe I want to go somewhere else. Maybe I need to let that thought go and instead be in my body, be in the moment, come to your senses, be here now. Go for a run, eat something delicious, do something to be in yourself. meditate, breathe, follow your breathing. And then whatever comes up when you do that, when you kind of try to come away from that mental control and loosen that mental control and be in your body, things are going to come up. So whatever comes up, feel it. Be willing to feel your pain and learn from it. And then going upwards, the connection part of it, connecting to a greater sense of self, remembering you are the sky, not the weather. And then what matters to you in this moment, even if you're feeling rubbish, what matters to you? What do you want your life to be about? Do something about it now, act on it, commit to that action. And this final, that outer layer, the act one, I think that's really so key for psychedelic integration. You've had these amazing openings, whatever it's been about for you. What is that going to do to your daily life? What is that going to make you do differently today, tomorrow, next year, for the rest of your life? So conclusions, next steps are that we're going to try using it. I mean, it's not perfect. I wish we were doing more therapy, but it's just the way it is. It's the stage we're at in the research where we are. And I'm looking forward to seeing how people find it. And anyone that wants to use it, then please get in touch. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much.